Good afternoon and welcome to the Missouri Senate.
For those who don't know me, I'm Lieutenant Governor Mike Parson, President of the Missouri Senate and a former senator. It is a great privilege to be joined here, this historical chamber, with past and current colleagues, as we pause to honor the memory of 13 former senators who have departed. I'm sure each one, if here today, would have a shared story or two about events, discussions, debates in this magnificent chamber. I would also like to extend a special welcome to the family members of those 13 senators being memorialized today, many who have traveled great distance to be here with us today. Thank you for sharing your family with us. And to start this ceremony this afternoon, would everyone please rise for the presentation of the colors led by the Missouri State Highway Patrol Color Guard Troop F. And please remain standing while Senator Kiki Curls leads us in the Pledge of Allegiance.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
And please remain standing as the color guard leaves the chamber. Reverend James Jackson will now provide our invocation.
Let's pray. To everything there is a season and a time for every purpose under the heavens, a time to be born and a time to die, a time to plant and a time to pluck up that which is planted, a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance, a time to get and a time to lose. God our Father, your power brings us to birth. Your foresight guides our lives. And by your command, we return to dust. Lord, our hope for all who have gone before us is based on your promise to be absent from the body is to be present with the Lord. We pray and hope for their families, relatives, colleagues, friends, and for all who are known to you alone. Lord God, we thank you for the dedicated service provided by these beloved members. The state of Missouri is better for the time, energy, and commitment they have given to their communities and to this state. Lord of all, we praise you for all who have entered into their rest. Give us grace to follow in their footsteps in the same manner in which they followed the path you laid out for them. Thank you for the memory of those you have called to yourself. By each memory, turn our hearts from things seen to things unseen, and lead us till we come to the eternal rest you have prepared for your people. In the name of Christ we pray. Amen.
Please be seated. The men's choir of the Calvary Lutheran High School, Jefferson City, will now sing Precious Lord.
I am tired, I am weak.
Next, I would like to introduce the leader and the 77th Pro Tem of the Missouri Senate. It is my honor to introduce President Pro Tem Ron Richard.
Thank you, Governor Parson. Before we continue, I'd like to also welcome some of our special guests who are in attendance today. On the bench to my left, I'm honored to introduce Governor Eric Greitens, former Governor Jay Nixon, former Lieutenant Governor Peter Kinder, former Lieutenant Governor Joe Maxwell, former President Pro Tem Jim Matheson, former President Pro Tem Mrs. Charlie Shields, former President Pro Tem Mike Gibbons, former President Pro Tem Tom Dempsey, former President Pro Tem Rob Mayer. On my bench to the right, I'm honored to introduce Secretary of State Jay Ashcroft, Attorney General Josh Hawley, Treasurer Eric Smith. Also, I'd like to recognize former members of the Senate who are in attendance today. Would senators who are present in the upper gallery please rise? Thank you very much for coming for today's service. We are honored by your presence. It is a pleasure to serve as President Pro Tem of the 99th General Assembly. It reminds me that we weren't the first to sit in these seats, and we won't be the last. This year, we celebrate the centennial of the construction of the Missouri State Capitol in Jefferson City. On March 16, 1917, the Senate met for the first time in this beautiful chamber. For 100 years, senators have convened in this very room, answering roll calls, debating important pieces of legislation. If you entered the building today from the south entrance, you were greeted by a 13-foot statue of Thomas Jefferson, the man the city was named after, representing the signing of the Louisiana Purchase. President Jefferson is also represented here in this upper chamber. On the panel behind me, in the depiction, he is greeting Lewis and Clark before they would embark on their grand expedition. It is from that expedition that our great state emerged and has continued to be shaped by the men and women who are recognized today. Former senators showed a great deal of enthusiasm for Missouri. They made sacrifices, fought hard for what they believed in, and lived true to the duty of public service. The 13 senators being honored today were no exception. They were great men and women who served before us, and their memories live among us in the Senate's customs, rules, traditions of this great body. Traditionally in the Senate, when one of our colleagues passes away during session, as a tribute, a single white rose is placed on the late senator's desk. Later, we will continue that tradition as we honor those former senators who have gone before us by placing a rose and lighting a candle in their memory during roll call. The 13 senators memorialized today hail from every corner of the Show Me State. Each one was elected by their communities to be a voice of the people in Jefferson City. They were mentors, friends, leaders, and will be forever united together. These men and women have shaped our communities and have changed Missouri. They will never be forgotten. As they always will be a husband, wife, father, mother, son, daughter, they too will always be a senator, living forever in a place in history. As President Jefferson stated, a morsel of genuine history is a thing so rare as to always be valuable. I encourage everyone today to share those stories of our history so we can preserve the past and use those experiences to govern with integrity and unite together to move the Show Me State into the future. Now, to honor our departed senators, I would like to introduce two former senators who have joined me and will join me on the dais. Former Lieutenant Governor Kinder is an 8th generation Missourian, born and raised in Cape Girardeau, was elected the 46th Lieutenant Governor of the state of Missouri in 2004. He previously served 12 years in the Missouri Senate and was the first Republican elected President Pro Tem in 53 years. After he was elected Lieutenant Governor, he gave the Tour of Missouri life, attracting an estimated 1.2 million spectators to the Show Me State, creating a direct economic impact of $80 million. He also has been a champion of issues affecting Missouri's seniors and veterans. There are few people who have been more institutional knowledge and had love of this great state than Peter Kinder. Also joining Governor Kinder is another great Missourian and longtime leader of the Senate from Sedalia. An avid sportsman, James L. Matheson was born in Warsaw, Missouri, and served as a Democrat in the Missouri House of Representatives beginning in 1975 and then in the Missouri Senate to 2005. During his time in this chamber, he was elected President Pro Tem by his colleagues, and today is one of the longest serving Pro Tems in Missouri history, serving for 8 years. Senator Matheson was instrumental in garnering support for the Missouri State Fair from the General Assembly and now serves on the State Fair Commission. Through the years, he has remained an active participant in his community and is well regarded for his knowledge, courage, and integrity. Senator Matheson.
Thank you, Mr. Pro Tem, very much for the kind introduction. I appreciate that very much. It is an honor for me to stand here. Back many years ago, there was a House member that stood up on the floor of the Missouri House of Representatives and said, "I will tell you all in this chamber one of the problems there is in the Senate, why they don't get a lot of things done. They stand around and call each other senator." Well, he'd play hell today, wouldn't he? With all of you here and all of us here, because we all serve with pride and dignity and found no fault in being called a politician. So I am honored that I am here. I'm grateful for the privilege of serving the people of Missouri in this chamber for 24 years. Today, again, it's a privilege to pay homage to my colleagues and predecessors who were entrusted with the privilege of serving in this chamber as well. James Madison, the fourth President of the United States and the man largely credited for having written our great Constitution, had a special regard for the senates. In a letter to Thomas Jefferson, he called senates the great anchor of government. In the Federalist Papers, Madison said of the senates, "Such an institution may be sometimes necessary as a defense to the people against their own temporary errors and delusions. Since Rome's greatest days, when it was governed by a senate, not an emperor, to today, senates and senators distinguish themselves through service to their state, their nation, and their fellow man. And today, it is my privilege to join with you to honor some of those great senators who distinguished themselves through service to their state here in this chamber. I served with all 13 except 2. I served with 11 of those senators. The first one I'd like to make comments about was Senator Donald Graylick. State Senator Don Graylick was a true and devoted friend and to the working man. He was born in 1929 in St. Louis County, attended St. Louis public and parochial schools, and graduated from Washington University. A lifetime Democrat, Graylick served in the legislature from 62 to 78. He was a delegate to 4 Democrat national conventions and ran against Dick Gephardt in a congressional primary in 1976. Graylick was a third-generation electrical worker. His grandfather was the international president of the IBEW from 1919 to 1929. His local, IBEW Local 1, was the first in the country. Graylick himself served as the president of this local from 1972 until 1995. 3 of his 4 sons would go on to become electrical workers also. Graylick was a U.S. Army veteran who served during the Korean conflict. After his legislative tenure, he served as vice chairman of the Missouri Veterans Commission until his retirement in 1993. Graylick was a true supporter and champion for the middle class. He devoted his legislative effort to championing the interest of the working class who built this nation and the fighting men and women who defended our freedom. And Graylick's efforts were not limited to the legislative and executive branches of government. Graylick mounted a landmark challenge against a state constitutional amendment that required candidates for Congress to declare unconditional support for term limits. Graylick took up the mantle of that and fought this all the way to our nation's highest court, and he won. To this day, the decision bears his name in the case Cook versus Graylick. Don Graylick married Miss Rita Simeon in 1954, beginning a marriage that would last for 61 years. The couple had 4 sons. Senator Graylick passed away in December 2015 at the age of 86. Thank you. Peter?
President Pro Tem Richard and Senator Mike Kehoe do me a great honor in asking me to come and share this dais with my friend Jim Mathewson and try to evoke the memory and the special memories of so many great senators. As I get to that responsibility, I'd like to tell a brief story, not to call attention to myself nor to my family, but to illustrate the fact that the Missouri Senate is truly an extended family and has long been that way. On the 1st of July, 2000, my brother got the phone call that no family wants to get. In this case, our call came from the Georgia Highway Patrol. Your parents have been in an accident. Your mother will survive with fairly serious injuries, concussion and broken bones. No broken bones, but abrasions and bruises. And your father didn't make it. So we were coming up on the 4th of July weekend and planning a funeral. And the funeral was held, I believe, 5 days later. I was astounded at all of my extended Jefferson City family, and especially senators, who made the long trip to Cape Girardeau for that occasion. There was an airplane that brought Jim Mathewson and Ed Quick and a lot of Sidney Johnson and a lot of my friends from the western side of the state. And at the funeral itself, the reverse was true at the visitation, but at the funeral service itself, the Democrats outnumbered the Republicans on that occasion. I hope to suggest to you that by that example, what a meaningful and unforgettable and unforgettably touching message was sent. Now, my first senator to eulogize, and I arrived in 1993, so I didn't serve with 11 of these, but my first senator to eulogize is one I did not know, Senator Vince Baker, and he served, was elected in a special election in 1955 from the Independence area and served for only 2 years. But in reading his, and by the way, not only did I not know him, I have found no member of the Senate or Senate staff who knew Senator Baker, since his service ended almost 60 years ago, and he died quite recently at the age of 94. But Senator Baker served his country. He hit Omaha Beach on D-Day. How about that? He served in 5 campaigns in the European theater, all the way to VE Day. He then earned a law degree back in Kansas City. After his service in the Senate, he continued his practice of law until being appointed by Governor Bond to the bench, where he served with honor and distinction until his retirement. And so we honor Senator Vince Baker here today with all these others.
Senator Mary Groves Bland, bless her heart. Where do I start? She was so special, it was unbelievable. In the last period of her time here in the Senate with me, she would drive a little cart around, a little motorized cart, and she'd come wheeling through that door because she sat right back here. And every morning as we would start the session, I'd walk over and kiss her on the head and say, "Good morning, my dear. How are you?" And always it was the same. It made no difference how she felt. She said, "I'm blessed, Jim. I'm blessed." Mary Bland. This chamber sometime is known as the Old Boys Club. Senator Mary Bland was a refreshing exception to that rule. At levels of government where big business, big interests, and big money fight hard, Senator Mary Bland was a champion for those who sometimes had to fight hard just for the next meal or the safe place to stay. Senator Bland was a remarkable servant, not only to her constituents, but first to her God. She was a deeply devoted Christian whose works for others were rivaled only by the strength of her faith. She was an advocate for better access to health care and for improved mental health programs. She sponsored legislation that required businesses selling alcohol to post warnings about the risks alcohol could pose to expectant mothers. Simply put, Mary was always ready to fight for what she believed in her heart to be right. She was a tireless advocate for universal health care, and year after year she would file legislation to place a moratorium on the death penalty in our state. Senator Bland was a former president of Freedom Inc. and was active in the Missouri Legislative Black Caucus. In the community, she worked hard with young people, encouraging them to better themselves by going to college and to give back to the community by becoming involved in public service. Senator Bland was a senator of great compassion and remarkable accomplishments, and in her endeavors, she overcome both barriers and serious personal hardships involving her own health. When we served together, Senator Bland would hurry from meeting to committee hearing to floor debate on the electric cart, as I mentioned. She'd ring a little bell to let the crowds know she was coming, and it was a good idea not to get in the way of Senator Bland, because she was moving on. When sessions would begin, I would see her outside my office here on the third floor, and I would ask her how she was doing. And always, as I stated before, "I am blessed," she would say. Indeed, she was, and so were we. Those of us who had the pleasure of serving with this remarkable senator and who still benefit from her efforts to help others here in the General Assembly. Senator Bland was born in Kansas City in 1936, graduated from RIT Cole High School there in 1956. She earned many certificates in community relations. She served in the Missouri House from 81 to 88 and to the Missouri Senate from 1998 to 2004. A widow, Senator Bland had 4 children, many grandchildren, and many great-grandchildren. Senator Bland was called home by the Lord. She served so faithfully in February 2016. Thank you.
Senator Betty Sims. What a remarkable lady Betty Sims was, and how, with what great affection we remember her and her service in this chamber. I had the honor of getting to know her some years before I came here. I think Senator Bond or Senator Danforth got me appointed to a regional selection panel for the White House Fellows, Governor Greitens, and we met in St. Louis. And Betty Sims was on the selection panel, and we became fast friends through, I think, 2 or 3 years of doing that. So I was so delighted after I got here to know that she was running in a tough district, very competitive race for the Senate. We helped Betty get elected. She didn't need much help. This remarkable lady grew up in St. Louis, went off to Smith College, an elite school back east, finished her degree at Washington University. Many years later, earned an MBA degree while she was raising 2 beautiful daughters and married to her beloved husband, Bill Sims, Dr. Bill Sims, also a Washington University product. And you might think a lady with that pedigree, Smith College, Ladue, Washington University, you might be surprised at some of the things she did in her life. She ran businesses, she owned businesses, and if I'm not mistaken, one of them was a potato chip business. And I remember a story about when Betty Sims drove a semi-tractor trailer truck down to my district, Mississippi County, the easternmost district in the state of Missouri, to pick up her potatoes from the potato farmers down there, to load up that truck and drive it back to her potato chip business in St. Louis. There was nothing Betty Sims couldn't do. She tackled a job and she got it done. She was a volunteer leader in the junior league, and you can read all of her other distinctions in her biography, but she was a beloved person in St. Louis, in the greater St. Louis community, and throughout the state of Missouri. I also remember attending the funeral service for her mother in that beautiful church on Wydown, the Church of St. Michael and St. George. And I remember something from the liturgy. From boyhood, I've tried to take at least one thing away from every memorial service, funeral, or what have you. And from that, where we were mourning the loss of Betty's mother, I remember the lector saying, and I repeated this, I stole this fair and square, and repeated this later as we dedicated the Ron Kirchhoff Gallery out here when we lost Ron Kirchhoff way too young. That God will not He will not allow miserable, miserly death to defeat His divine extravagance. So I took that away from Betty Sims's mother's service, and I offer it up to you now in remembrance of her and all these great senators.
Senator John Johnson, that I speak of now, was one of those that I didn't serve with. Senator Johnny Johnson was born in St. Louis in 1926 and attended Roosevelt High School there. Johnson served in the United States Navy in the South Pacific Theater from 1944 to 46. After the war, he returned to St. Louis, where he attended Washington University, earning a degree in political science in 1952. Johnson became an insurance broker and real estate investor. In 1958, he was elected Democrat committeeman for Concord Township, and he was reelected in 60 and 64. He also served as chairman of St. Louis County Democrat Committee and served in that capacity until 1970. He was a delegate to the Democrat National Convention in 1964 and 1968. He was elected to represent the citizens of the 15th Senatorial District in 1960, 64, and 68. During those years of service, from 1960 to 72, Senator Johnson was witness to noteworthy and historic events here in this chamber, the Missouri Senate. In those days, General Assemblies convened only every other year. Growing demands on state government were such that many special sessions were required, leading eventually to annual sessions. In those days, governors were the boss, and in the Senate, the lieutenant governor, the governor's proxy, assigned bills to committee, at least until the Senate seized control in the late 1960s and reshaped the balance of power in Missouri with a rule change delegating that responsibility to the president pro tem. In 1969, Warren Hearns was governor and Earl Blackwell was president pro tem. The state was cash-strapped, and Hearns had called a special session and asked the legislature to enact a tax increase. Blackwell, strongly against increasing taxes, was joined by two other senators in filibustering the bill. The debate, the filibuster, dragged on as the clock ticked down on the special session. And then the Senate did something it had never done before, not ever. It moved the previous question. October 1969, the Senate voted to stop debate for the first time since statehood in 1821. Blackwell was seriously damaged as pro tem by his battles with the governor of the Senate of the same party. He survived the special session and returned as pro tem in January 1970, but by then his support had vanished. Blackwell had the dais, and knowing the inevitable motion to replace him was coming, refused to recognize anyone for that purpose. Whoa. Hold on. Blackwell held the dais until the Senate adjourned. Early the next morning, he left the building and did not return. This was the Battle of the Young Turks, led by Blackwell and the Old Guard. They caucused, elected a new pro tem, J.F. Patterson, who had long been associated with the Old Guard, as the new pro tem. Senator John Johnson survived the Great Depression as a child, fought in the Pacific Theater in World War II, participated in the 1964 and 1968 National Democrat Convention, and served in this chamber to vote on the first motion to end debate. Approved rules given the Senate power over its own bills, and witness a battle that cost the pro tem his job. What a remarkable life. Senator Johnson served in the Senate until 1972. He was previously married to Louise Hahn, and they had two children. He continued to live in his beloved St. Louis County until his death in August of 2016. Senator Johnny Johnson.
This one I'll probably choke up on. My friend Carl Vogel. It's 1 year ago this week that we said goodbye to Carl Vogel. I remember Carl served in the House before he came here, of course. Carl was a true son of the state of Missouri and a true son of Cole County. One of the oldest families in this county, raised in the family of Coca-Cola here in mid-Missouri, and beloved by everyone who knew him. Carl Vogel, I'll tell you what, at the University of Missouri, I believe began courting the young lady who became his wife, Kimberly Grice. And many were the suitors who were seeking that hand of the lovely and beautiful and talented Kimberly Grice. But Carl won her among his greatest distinctions. They raised a son, Jake, who went off to serve our country in the recent war on terror, I believe in both Afghanistan and Iraq, with honor and distinction as an airborne ranger. But even before that, when Carl was running, he ran for the House first in 1990, and then for the Senate in 2002, and never lost in his 20 years service in this building. I would not have wanted to run against Carl Vogel for any office here. I'll just tell you. As Dwayne Benton explained to me when I was new here about the Vogels, he said, you know, Carl's Catholic. Dwayne Benton, formerly of the Missouri Supreme Court, now on the 8th U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals, he said, you know, Carl's Catholic, from a long line of Catholic family, and Kim's Baptist. And Kim sings all over town, so they pretty much got this town covered. Boy, did they ever. And Carl was the gracious host. Carl sat right down there where Senator from Lamar sits right now, and I was presiding in the office I held at the time, Lieutenant Governor, and we have a strict rule that those of you, our visitors, may have been admonished about before you entered today of your cell phones. We'd prefer you not bring them in, but if you're going to bring them in, put them on silent. We don't want to hear anything go off, no pagers, nothing. Well, I'm presiding up here. We're starting the day's business, and it happened to be my birthday. And I hear a recording start. And I grabbed for the gavel and probably got red-faced in anger to admonish some senator about the gavel. Well, the recording went on. And the chamber soon became aware that it was a recording of Marilyn Monroe singing "Happy Birthday, Mr. President" to Jack Kennedy. And it was Carl Vogel there was some conspiracy with the press table and that desk he sat at. And Jake evoked that wonderful memory at Carl's funeral mass a year ago this week. When Carl began to run for office, especially in that Senate campaign, because I wasn't here when he was running for the House at first, I quickly learned, I tried to make my business to know what was going on in these other races, and I quickly learned he had given away Coca-Cola products at every Little League, every parish dinner, every parish supper, every charitable activity that there possibly could be in all these counties, and nobody stood a chance against the team of Carl and Kim Vogel. And then his service here in the Senate, where his office was right across the hall where Senator Kehoe's office is now. And I don't think anybody does this before. I'm not sure anybody did it before, but who could forget Bubs Hohulen, who hung a hibachi out of one of those windows one year and was cooking, and the smoke was alternately blowing in throughout the Capitol halls and setting off the smoke alarms and out into the outside, the great outdoors. And the authorities were called, and the story made USA Today. But Carl went on from that to establish a Wednesday tradition during session in which he fed us every Wednesday. You walk in there about 10:30 in the morning. What's for lunch today? Oh, we got ribeyes. All right, good deal. Oh, next week it's fried fish, or bratwurst, or hamburgers, or something. And he and Bubs almost always had enough for leftovers on Thursday, and they were so gracious, and they allowed us all in there. Many of you were here in those years know what I'm talking about. He's one of a kind. My friend, Carl Vogel.
I think the first time as a little poor kid that I had a nickel, I bought a Coke. Buy them for a nickel back in those days, folks. That was a long time ago. Carl Vogel was my very dear friend because he had them by the case in there. And I would go in there regularly and drink a Coke off of Carl. Senator Kinder is exactly right. They were the host of the world in there usually about every day at lunchtime. Carl Vogel was a very, very special person. He always came to the state fair. And I'd say, can I do anything for you, Carl? Can I help you with anything? You know, because that was in my district for 24 years. And he said, I don't need a thing, Jim. I just come over to see what you was doing over here. And he came to the fair every year. He was a dear person, and I agree with you, Peter. He was a very special person. Bill Kaysen was born in Higginsville in 1924, attended public school in Clinton, Missouri, and was a graduate of the University of Missouri and the University of Missouri School of Law. Kaysen's career began as a grocery clerk in Clinton, and he became President Pro Tem, who played a decisive role in defining the balance of power in Missouri government. Kaysen served for 3 years as a bomber pilot with the Army Air Corps during World War II. After being admitted to the bar in 1951, he served 6 years as prosecuting attorney in Henry County. He served in the Senate from 1960 through 1976. He served as both Majority Floor Leader and President Pro Tem. As a senator, he sponsored a number of landmark measures. One established the state's open records and open meetings law, the Sunshine Law. He also sponsored a series of bills to clean up hazardous and toxic sites left by the mining industry across our state. And he sponsored legislation creating the Missouri Veterans Commission to help ensure veterans and access to programs. Bill Kaysen was also the lawmaker who won approval for the state's public accommodation law. Despite some serious pushback from his district, Kaysen was compelled to pass this legislation after a fellow attorney who happened to be African American lamented the fact that he couldn't drive from Kansas City to Springfield with his family and use a restroom, or get a meal in a restaurant along the way because of the color of their skin. Bill Kaysen passed the law that changed that in Missouri. Each of these bills touched the lives of millions of Missourians. Here in this chamber, we will also find interesting the events of June 15, 1973. And Senator Kaysen, because it affects the way this body conducts itself to this very day. This was a biggie. June the 15th, 1973 was the last day of the first session of the 77th Missouri General Assembly. In those days, sessions went till midnight, and the budget was not completed in advance of the last day. Senator Kaysen was President Pro Tem. The legislature had not completed work on the state budget, and a long fight loomed on that final day. Senator Kaysen was an advocate of the death penalty for capital cases in Missouri. A fellow Democrat, Larry Lee, a devoutly religious lawmaker from St. Louis, strongly opposed the death penalty, and he had a bill to abolish it. Lieutenant Governor Bill Phelps, a Republican, presided that morning. But Kaysen feared that if Phelps recognized Senator Lee to bring up his death penalty bill, debate would go to midnight and the session would adjourn without a budget being passed. Senator Kaysen informed the Lieutenant Governor that he, not Phelps, would preside that afternoon. The decision was not well taken by Lieutenant Governor, who announced that he would be presiding. The Pro Tem decided to preclude this by locking the chamber door. With Lieutenant Governor on the other side, not to be outdone, the Lieutenant Governor entered the chamber through a side gallery and was promptly removed by the Sergeant of Arms upon the direction of the Pro Tem. Getting hot, isn't it? I remember this well. Kaysen retained control of the dais. The budget was approved and death penalty bill by Senator Lee died on the calendar. Lieutenant Governor Bill Phelps retreated to his office to confer with A. Clifford Jones, my good friend, Senator Emory Melton, my good friend, and others of his caucus, of his party. The debate moved across the street to the Supreme Court of Missouri, which ruled in Danforth versus Kaysen that the President Pro Tem could not keep the Lieutenant Governor as ex officio President of the Senate from presiding. Despite being advised by Jones and Emory Milton to leave well enough alone, Bill Phelps went back for further clarification on the powers of the lieutenant governor. He should have listened to Cliffy. The court limited his power in this chamber pretty much to presiding. All right, Mikey. So Bill Kaysen was married to Lois, I remember her well, Virginia Beatty of Henry County, and they had 4 children. Senator Kaysen passed away in January of this year after reaching the remarkable age of 92 years. Thank you.
Although I did not serve with Senator Kaysen, but with his successor, about whom we'll speak in a few minutes. I was at the University of Missouri a couple of years behind his son, Brian. I don't know what members of the Kaysen family are here, but we were all kind of in awe of Brian Kaysen and his brain. He went on to medical school and a distinguished career in medicine, I believe, out in the San Francisco Bay Area, last I heard. And I remember him with great fondness, Brian Kaysen, Senator Kaysen's son. Senator Anita Yeckel, another great friend with whom I served from South St. Louis County. Senator Yeckel was elected in 1996 and again in 2000. Her husband Bob is here with us today and family, and we're grateful for that, as we are grateful for Anita. Her friendship, her warm smile, her outstanding abilities that commended her in election after election. She was educated there in St. Louis, worked in the financial services industry with the family-owned savings and loan there in the south part of the county. Worked with Bob. They were a team, always a team. And she ran for the school board and was elected again and again to the Lindbergh School Board. Was president of the Lindbergh School Board. Established quite a record in education, in leadership for education throughout St. Louis County and the state of Missouri long before she came to the Missouri Senate in that successful first race in 1996. Here she also served with distinction and honor. Always pleasant in floor debate, always prepared, always ready for friend or foe. Nothing was ever personal with Senator Yeckel. She focused on the issue, the way senators do at our best in this chamber, not the person, but on the issue. And she brought that financial expertise and the knowledge of the banking industry to her service here. And we remember Senator Yeckel with great love and affection. And I remember getting to the funeral home last year and greeting Bob and other family members there on that sad occasion and looking at all the wonderful pictures. And I saw again that warm smile come to life. And I'm reminded of the words of the poet who said, "I see her in the dewy flowers. I see her bright and fair." Senator Anita Yeckel.
Sir Edward E. Quick. This is a hard one for me. Ed Quick was as good a friend as I ever had. I miss him every day. All the people, it has been my privilege to know Ed was one of the most remarkable. Truly, he was. He came from a pretty tough background. As a child, he worked beside other family members as a migrant farm worker picking fruit and vegetables. He once told me that peaches were the hardest and strawberries were the easiest. But easy wasn't what Ed Quick was about. He had a strong will, a quiet spirit, and a deep determination to make a difference in the world. Ed enlisted in the Navy when he was 17. I think he really was 16, and honorably served his country in Korea. When he returned after the war, he became a firefighter in Kansas City. Of all this man accomplished in his remarkable life, he was most proud of being a Kansas City firefighter and what he was able to help people with that. He used to say when it was tough for others, it was just right for Station 22. In 1975, he was an underdog candidate for the Kansas City Council. In typical Ed Quick fashion, he overcame the odds and won that election. Serving as councilman for the 1st District in 1985, he ran and won a seat in the Missouri Senate. In the Senate, Ed was a workhorse, quiet and determined. I knew him for 40 years. He never wasted a word. He quickly earned the respect of all of his colleagues. He championed the working class. He knew firsthand their challenges. He was there for our public schools. He was there for our police and firefighters. And more than anything else, he was there for Missouri children who needed access to health care. Senator Quick sponsored a major piece of legislation to establish the Children's Health Initiative called CHIPS. There was stiff opposition, but like a fireman swinging an axe, he worked relentlessly. Hearing after hearing, debate after debate, session after session, until he passed that legislation and secured access to health care for those children. Senator Quick became a committee chairman, then Majority Floor Leader, then President Pro Tem of the Missouri Senate. When you went into Ed's office when he was a senator, a floor leader or Pro Tem, behind his desk was a white firefighter's helmet from station number 22. When things were really tough for others, they were just right for Senator Quick, the senator we honor here today. Ed Quick was born in Rich Hill, Missouri in 1935. He attended school in Higginsville. He was married to Miss Jane Pfeiffer, who I think maybe is my friend Jane is here today. God love you, baby. And they have 5 children. Senator Ed Quick passed away in August of 2016. May he rest in peace.
Before I move to the next senator to be eulogized, I feel it necessary to say something about my friend Ed Quick as well. Ed Quick was a gentleman's gentleman. Quiet, even-tempered. I can see that hint of a smile developing on his face as some amusing observation was made or to him or by him. But there's an important senatorial moment of history that should be noted. For all time. I don't believe in 196 years of statehood we've had a moment like this. So here's what happened. The election of 2000, November 2000, resulted in 3 vacancies in this chamber. Senator Lacey Clay was elected to the U.S. Congress. Senator Sam Graves from Northwest Missouri was elected to the U.S. Congress. Senator Joe Maxwell was elected to the position of Lieutenant Governor. That's November 2000. Special elections in due course were called for late January 2001. not quite 3 months, but nearly 3 months from Election Day, in each of those 3 senatorial districts. Here was the partisan makeup of this body. 16 Republicans, first time we had even had a plurality since the 40s, to 15 Democrats, 16 to 15, with 3 vacancies. Ed Quick had been the pro tem, and the party caucuses meet the Thursday after the election to elect their leaders. It fell to me, in the category of a blind hog finds an acorn every now and then, to be elected the leader of the Republican caucus, which had not a majority, but a plurality in this body. Now, how are you going to proceed to organizing the body? This was what the lawyers call a case of first impression. There was really nothing to go by here in the state of Missouri. Case of first impression meaning simply this set of facts has never been presented on this point, on this issue before. And so we had to negotiate, we had to meet. And there followed a series of meetings, tentative and awkward at first, sort of you show me your hand, I'll show you my hand, between Ed and me. And I mention this because I think it's an extraordinary moment in the history of the state. We proceeded in extra-legal, extra-constitutional fashion. Somebody could have challenged it in court and struck down what we're doing, but here's what we did. We worked out an agreement, and this, by the way, at a time when other chambers in Florida and Tennessee and perhaps some other states were tied, and they were unable to organize their body. They were unable to produce a budget within the legally and constitutionally required time. Ed Quick and I got together, and we said, we're just going to call ourselves co-president pro tems. Now, that's an interesting thing constitutionally and legally, inasmuch as President pro tem is a constitutional office and as such is indivisible. It is no more divisible than the office of Attorney General or Lieutenant Governor or Governor. And the inauguration of the governor that takes place early in January, right after 5 days after the legislature convenes, is a joint session of the General Assembly held out on the steps, weather permitting, presided over by the President of the Senate, the President pro tem of the Senate. So on that occasion, we worked out that we would take turns presiding. Now again, this could have been torpedoed by any well-planned legal attack, but I guess we carried it off. We carried it off through that inaugural of Governor Bob Holden, and we carried it off for the days in January remaining to the last week of the month when the special elections were decided, and we went up with an 18 to 16 majority at a time when Bob Holden was governor and the Democrats still had a big majority in the Senate, in the House, excuse me. And I asked Kit Bond, I said, okay, so I'm leader of this 18 Senator caucus. I said, will it be like herding cats? And he said, no, it'll be more like loading frogs into a wheelbarrow, which indeed it was. That's a great moment of Ed Quick and what a gentleman he was and how he took the idea of the institution and the importance of state government first and foremost over any other consideration. And so now it falls to me, I think we're now approaching the giants who served here so long, the real giants. It falls to me to eulogize one of the great giants of the last 100 years, Senator Emory Melton. I see his son Stan here. I'm delighted to see Senator Melton's son here. Emory Melton was a giant, a man of incredible, unimpeachable integrity, a symbol of integrity at home and in this building. a poor kid being raised by hardworking people in southwest Missouri, God-fearing, church-going Baptists. A man who knew the Bible. A man who could quote verse after verse from memory. A man who came here to do the business of the people and to do it and to take it seriously, that is, to take the business seriously and not take himself seriously. So the man I'm describing was a pillar of all this, but he didn't take himself seriously, and he had a marvelous sense of humor. And I have a story about him from the first day I was sworn in here. I was evoking the 25th chapter of the book of Matthew in this chamber. I was the least of these, sitting right there on the inside of this aisle in the front row. And Senator Melton told me that it was good not to worry about that. He had sat in that seat once, and in due course I'd be moving elsewhere. But I brought my mother and my aunt to the swearing in, among other family members. And I've got to tell you, Steve Danner knows what I'm talking about when I mentioned the Hunter family of the Boot Heel of southeast Missouri. My mother was a Hunter, and it is one of the most prominent Democratic names in the Boot Heel. I never won a majority of the Hunters in any election. And my aunt, my favorite aunt was her older sister. They all had double names. My mother was Mary Frances, and her older sister was Mabel Louise. And Mabel Louise, I am the only Republican she ever voted for. And I know it wasn't easy. But I introduced them to Senator Melton. And they were raised by a Southern grandmother and mother, so they were Southern ladies. And they walked out of this chamber, and all they could talk about was how charming Senator Melton was. He charmed them. And Emory lived a long life, as you know, dying only in December 15, 16 months ago. But right before his death, we knew he was declining. We knew he was beginning to fail. And, in fact, he talked about it. Some of us were invited to a luncheon for Senator Melton in Cassville at the end of June, I believe 2015. I have that right, Stan? And it was at the Emory Melton Lodge at Roaring River State Park. And I remember driving down that day, that beautiful drive from Springfield, and thinking I would never get to Cassville. And in fact, I was late for the luncheon, which had gone on. But imagine my Missouri Senate pride on that day in June, a year and a half ago, soon be 2 years ago, when I walked into the luncheon room, and there was quite a panoply of former and current Missouri senators there. The first person I saw was Harold Caskey, and Kay, who's here with us today, seated on one side of Emory. Now, I get started naming those who were there, and I'm going to be in trouble. But Harold and Kay Caskey were there. How touching it was for them, with Harold's health condition at the time, to have taken the trouble to go all the way down there, to be there, to honor Emory on this occasion. Senator Richard was there. Senator Doyle Childers was there. Senator Sater was there. And I felt bad about being a little late until John T. and Mrs. Russell came in even later than I did. But it was such a wonderful occasion of camaraderie and memories of all of us who were honored to be there to honor Emory Melton. What a giant he was. For those of us freshmen trying to figure out where the bathroom is in this building, to come in late when a vote is already underway, you look to see where Emory was on the issue. And wherever Emory was, I was okay voting that way. I would always check to see what the issue was, but you didn't go wrong once you knew where Emory Melton was. He lived a long life. He practiced law with distinction. He owned newspapers in that town. And he brought honor and distinction to everything he did. And after that occasion that I just described, that luncheon, that wonderful, memorable luncheon, a few days later, in early July, I received a letter from Emory thanking me for attending, something he didn't need to thank me for attending. But he said, in some of the most poignant words I've ever read in any letter, he said, "I feel my strength failing and the end is nigh." And it came about 5 months later. This great senator, this great Missourian, this great learned man, this great man of God, you know, there's something else about him. He was in the Army. He was in the Army of Occupation in Japan in 1946. And I believe his father got special dispensation to file him for prosecuting attorney while he was still in the Army in Japan. He got home in time to win the election that year. Emory Melton, what a life. We honor him today.
Peter, I can sell a little personal thing on my part, like you just did about your aunt being a Democrat. I had a sister that was a very strong Republican. In fact, she was a committee woman. First time I ran for the Senate, she lived in Benton County, and all the other commissioners on the Republican Party was watching her to see, was she going to vote for me? I think she swallowed pretty hard, probably threw up, but she voted for me. You know, but she never let me forget that she did. People have often asked me, how was it that I, served here 8 years as pro tem? It's a long time. It was a very long time, and I'm honored by it. I'm honored to be here today because of it. Every night after dinner, I'd make the rounds. And one of my first stops would be in Emory Melton's office. Emory, what are we doing right and what are we doing wrong and what do we need to change? And he and I would sit up there and visit because he was always there, preparing amendments for my bills generally. Because he'd have a lot of them. But I cared deeply about him personally. And I showed that, I hope, many, many times. Person I speak of next is Senator Harold Caskey. Sit right over there. It's been said that when one rises to match wits in the Missouri Senate debate, Missouri Senate, one best not be unarmed. And none was better armed in the Senate war of wits than State Senator Harold Caskey, a senator from Bates, who loved to get on my case daily. He had a remarkable ability to foresee future problems, and I'm going to point out a couple of them, and to quietly put language into bills that would address those problems time and again. He'd put language in that received little attention. Then maybe 2 years later, maybe 10 years later, a situation would arise and we'd finally understand what Harold had been doing. Harold graduated with honors from Central Missouri State University, and he earned his law degree, again with honors from University of Missouri at Columbia. Harold worked as an attorney in private practice and served as prosecuting attorney for Bates County from '76 to 2000. He was elected to the Missouri Senate. He served as majority leader, majority caucus chair, and minority caucus chair. He was chairman of the Civil and Criminal Jurisprudence Committee and served on committee ranging from education to agriculture. Don't challenge Harold Caskey on this floor about the school foundation formula, because he would eat you with it. Maybe not always been right, but he'd be close enough you wouldn't want to challenge him. He was a conservative Democrat. He sponsored and eventually passed the state's first concealed carry permit law. He was unabashed champion of law and order. He worked year after year to codify the state criminal code. He passed the Omnibus Drug Control Act to address the illegal drug trade, and he worked relentlessly to free Missouri from the control of federal courts in ordering desegregation payments in Kansas City schools. He was so highly regarded by the law enforcement community that the Missouri Highway Patrol, including 2 former colonels, served as pallbearers at his funeral. Fact, because I was there. The Missouri Deputy Sheriff's Association named the Harold Caskey Defender of Freedom Award for him. In 1993, Missouri court struck down the state's system of providing state aid to public schools, saying it ranged from golden to god-awful. Senator Caskey sponsored Senate Bill 380, which overhauled the formula, making funding more adequate and equitable without reducing funding for a single school district. Oh, and he put in language that if a district failed to meet standard, parents could send their children to a different district. That was in 1993. No one foresaw that except Caskey until 20 years later when it happened. Senator Harold Caskey, my friend, was brilliant, and he was also clever. He'd stand at his desk. Someone would poise like a cobra, ready to strike until he was recognized. Just stand there and stare at me if I was presiding. And then it was game on. He once characterized a bill to expand a program as being like a giant dinosaur with a tiny, tiny brain, a beast that couldn't really think except to chomp, chomp, chomp. That had to do with the lottery, as I remember, Peter, you remember? It came to consuming tax dollars. The bill died, so too did a measure that he equated to creating gambling at restaurants catering to children. He killed that one, demanding by the sponsor was trying to convert Chuck E. Cheese to Chuck E. Sleaze. From his honors as a student and law scholar to passing major bills after major bill here, and for being a tireless and brilliant master of debate in the Senate. What Harold Caskey accomplished is not just remarkable, it is absolutely awe-inspiring. For you to see from the time he was a young boy, Harold Caskey was blind.
Awe-inspiring, I have to agree. Who could not agree? As I watched the senator from Bates at his seat right over there by the door, hold court without sight, being read to, and mastering the arcana and the most minute details of legislation, and able to quote them back to a senator who was cited, which was every other senator in the room, better than that senator knew the bill. Whether Harold was handling the bill, whether he was attacking the handler of a bill, or trying to help the handler of a bill. What a remarkable display of intelligence, character, fortitude, perseverance, and honor he brought to this chamber. As Jim Mathewson just related, he was known far and wide as the advocate for public education in the Senate, handled bill after bill after bill, but a lot of people might not know that a few years before I got here, probably in the late 80s, Harold Caskey passed the bill that guarantees the rights of homeschooling families in the state of Missouri. a champion of public education, stood up for that minority of Missourians who wish to have their children educated at home instead of in the public schools of our state. Harold Caskey's may have lacked the physical capacity of sight, but his vision was far-reaching, enough to encompass that. And I'll say one other thing about it that should be noted for history. I believe I am correct in saying he is the only member of the minority party who ever moved the previous question. And he did it on the bill Senator Mathewson just referenced, guaranteeing the right of Missourians to carry concealed weapons, which was done in the spring, either 03, 04. I was here when he moved the previous question on his dear friend Ken Jacob. Let that one sink in. It was a great day for liberty in the state of Missouri, brought to Missourians by the bill Harold Caskey sponsored, championed year after year, pushed through, and finally saw signed into law. Harold Caskey, a giant for the ages. And now we reach one of the last two gentlemen, one of the great senators, and one of the last two gentlemen, and the other one is here with us today, one of the last two lawmakers to serve 42 years in the General Assembly, John T. Russell of Laclede County. What a great, great Missourian Senator Russell was. The other senator was his great friend of the other party, who's here with us today, Wayne Good. Is he still here? For me, he was, there he is behind the pillar for me. They were quite a team. But Senator Russell and Senator Good came here to the House in the class of 1962. And they left here only because of term limits after the 2004 election. So my 12 years in the Missouri Senate, which was my entire tenure here, was their last 12 years of 42 years service in this building. Service with distinction, service with honor. John T. Russell was another true son of Missouri. Great family man in Lebanon, a great businessman, a business and civic leader in Lebanon, a man who knew what a day's work was on the shop floor, who knew what a lathe was, who knew what all kinds of machinery and machine tools were, because that was the business he chose. A great family man. His widow is with us, at least one of his daughters is with us, and I'm so glad to see you all. I remember I sat next to Senator Russell. He sat where Senator Munsinger is now, and I sat where Senator Leibla is now. And he was telling me about this grandson of his, who was his namesake, John Russell, Doug's son, my friend Doug's son, who was in high school, and he had performed very well. And he was a senior, and I said, well, John, didn't I hear that young man was accepted to Harvard? And he said, yes, he's been accepted to Harvard. And then John's brow sort of darkened. He didn't think much of Harvard. He said, I'm plugging for the University of Missouri for John Russell to go to, and that's, in due course, that's where he chose, where he sailed through in distinction. I remember him as a young kid working for then candidate Matt Blunt for governor, and then working with Governor Blunt in the office. And I know how proud John T. Russell was of his entire family. My friend Doug, who was a couple of years ahead of me at MU and served as a curator more than one term for the university, his daughters, his grandchildren, his wife of so many years. And John was conservative. He was sort of my conservative anchor. If he thought I was getting too too far in with when I was Senate leader with supporting some things the cities wanted, he'd sort of yank on my shirt sleeve and tell me about how things look down in Laclede County in southwest Missouri, where he lived, where he died, where he raised a family, and where he is buried. John T. Russell served his country with distinction in the Air Force. He compiled a great record in business. His son followed him in that business and is there now. And we remember him, you know, when Republicans took the majority after 53 years in 2001, and John was our senior member, there was no question who would be the Senate Appropriations Chairman. And he was a steady hand in difficult budget times. It was not easy. He was not a young man anymore, but he was up to the midnight and the 1 a.m. committee hearings. And he'd be back at 8 a.m., if not before, the next morning, ready for another day of that kind of tough grind. And we got through those tough budget years because of the steady hand on the tiller and the character and the knowledge and the integrity of John T. Russell, working so closely in harness and in tandem with his dear friend, Wayne Good. And they had very few disagreements. They came from different parts of the state and different philosophical backgrounds. But again, they held the institution of the Senate and the state budget and the state of Missouri first and foremost. Doing right by the university, doing right by mental health, doing right by corrections, and all the other tough decisions that have to be made. So we honor him. We honor John T. Russell, our good friend who we lost way too young.
I too sought his counsel on a regular basis. I don't think Senator Russell and I ever disagreed on anything unless it was workers' comp. Boy, he had an opinion about workers' comp, bless his heart. But we finally worked one out, and I think it served the people of the state of Missouri very, very well. It's my pleasure now to submit the last honoree today, Senator John Snyder. I know that his family, his two sons and daughter, are here today, and I thank you for that. Thank you for sharing your father with us for so many years. Senator Snyder served the citizens of Florissant and all of Missouri for more than 3 decades. John's colleagues in the Senate respected him, his adversaries feared him, and his constituents loved him. He saw his role here as nothing less than that of guardian angel with a law degree. I was telling his son today, John would often get up and, want to argue with me about my legislation or some issue or whatever. But he'd get carried away, and he'd start, doing these things, and he'd always just like this, just drive you goofy because he was acting like this. But he had one little thing that I watched very, very carefully. When he'd start turning his wristwatch, I had him. And I never told him until we were both out of the Senate 4 or 5 years, and I finally said, John, you had a weakness, partner. You're a hell of a debater. But you shouldn't have twisted your wristwatch when you started telling me crap that didn't amount to anything, because I had you. I loved him. He often, the years that I was pro tem, was a pain in the butt, but it wasn't because he was a bad person. It was just because John always wanted to be right. And sometimes he was. I'm sorry, I got to kind of slip that one in there. After a 2-year term in the House, Senator Snyder served in the Senate from 1971 through 2002. I think it is safe to say that during that time he was involved in some way with every major piece of legislation passed into law because he thought he had an opinion about everything. And generally he did. On the floor, he was a one-man tour de force. He'd wave his arms, as I said, and he'd twist his wristwatch, he'd shout, he'd pound his desk, and he'd scrawl 4 amendments after 4 amendments to fine-tune legislation, fine-tune it to his opinion. One Capitol sage said John Snyder couldn't pass a dollar bill in the Capitol Cafe without amending it. But as a result of his efforts, this body made better law, and the people of this state were better served. Senator Snyder served as floor leader, chairman of the Judiciary Committee, and a member of the Parliamentary Committee. He kept a file in his office for every single point of order that had been ruled on in the Senate. Yep. And I've told this President Pro Tem, and I told that President Pro Tem right there, the hardest thing I ever had to do in my 8 years as Pro Tem was to rule on points of order. I'm not an attorney, but you had to do it because that was your job, and that was tough for me. Harold Caskey would jump up. Senator Snyder sometimes would beat him up. Every time I ruled on a point of order, and he would say, "Put that in the journal because I'll remind him he said that a week from now," and it was the opposite. That's my friends Harold and John. He didn't have to rule on points of order. John saw himself as the champion for the little guy, the disadvantaged and the oppressed who had no one to stand up for them. As a crusading, unabashed liberal, he worked to increase taxes on larger companies to help the smaller companies. He passed the legislation establishing the first real ethics law for the legislature. He passed the ATV law to help protect Missouri's streams and rivers, and above all, he was a relentless, incessant champion who worked to protect the unborn. Senator Snyder helped write and pass the legislation that ultimately led to the Webster versus Reproductive Health Services case and the subsequent legislation to ban partial birth abortion in Missouri. When he wasn't writing amendments, Snyder worked as an attorney handling workers' compensation and similar cases. Early in his career as an attorney, John Snyder was assigned to a pro bono case involving an inmate at the Missouri State Penitentiary. It's a good one. When he went to pick up the case file, the word "escaped" was stamped across it. He never met that client. The client's name was James Earl Ray. When it came to passing legislation in the Missouri Senate, it was always better if John was on your side. When the Post-Dispatch did a profile on him a few years ago, they characterized him as irrepressible. I termed him irresponsible. Sorry. I did that kind of on purpose. He certainly was that, but even more so, he was passionate. Whether John was rooting for his beloved St. Louis University Billikens basketball team or fighting for the poor, the disadvantaged, or the unborn, he was passionate about his causes and those he believed it was his role to help. It was that passion and that commitment that made John Snyder a truly great senator. John Snyder was born on March 1st, 1937, and died on March 2nd this year, one day after his 80th birthday. A native of St. Louis, he earned a bachelor's degree and a law degree from St. Louis University. In 1961, he married Mary Stephan, and they had 4 children. I know at least 3 of them are here today. In closing, my part, again, Lieutenant Governor Mike, Ron, floor leader, thank you all. You honored me by allowing me to be here and be a part of the ceremony today. Some of you young people that are here in the Senate, maybe because I'm old, when I kick off, maybe one of you will say something nice about me. God bless you. Thank you very much. Peter?
I must say something about my friend John Schneider. We were so saddened to learn of his passing just first of last month. John, Jim made reference to it, God, how he loved the Billikens. He loved his St. Louis University basketball team, and I believe was at the game the night before he died. When I was a freshman here in 1993, I learned that John would get up a van of senators and staff, and he would beg, plead, cajole, and bludgeon people into going with him to a Billiken game. And I would go with him. I remember Steve Ailman and I went to a couple of those games. Now, John, unlike me, John's a night owl, so he didn't mind the drive over there, leaving here at 5:30 or something after a full day here, drive into the game on the St. Louis U campus. And then he usually, as I recall, had some fairly nice dinner set up for after the game before you drove back to Jefferson City, getting back in at 1:30 or 2 in the morning before a busy day the next day. That's how much he loved his Billikens. I can remember him, I can hear him now, back in that seat on the back where Senator from Christian, Senator Wasson sits now, and you're right. Coat open, flapping his arms, his wrists going like this, his sleeves showing a lot of skin. I remember in that first session I was here, Missouri voters had just passed a constitutional amendment permitting casino gambling, for better or worse. I had voted against it, but the voters have approved it every time it's been before them. So we had an enabling bill, and you were President Pro Tem, and it came out on the floor, and Harry Wiggins was handling it, and John T. Russell, and it was thought it was all, the skids were greased for it. It was going right through as written. Well, that was before anybody had reckoned with John Schneider on the floor of the Missouri Senate. And he got out there and thundered, "This is the kind of bill that's going to get somebody beat if you vote for this. And I've got a bunch of motions to put before this body." And they were motions to go back to conference and instruct the conferees. That's an extraordinary motion for those of you who don't know legislative procedure, and you don't need to learn about it now, but pain in the backside comes into mind. John was a glorious senator and a pro-life lion in this body for decades. I am so proud of my friend John Schneider, and I know his family is too. Thank you all for listening to us this afternoon.
Thank you again, Governor Kinder and Senator Matheson, for such wonderful tribute to our honored senators. The Senate memorial services are held to honor those called to serve, symbolizing the enduring values of those memorialized. In a few moments, we'll have the final roll call for those 13 senators honored today. As we do, a current senator will answer here in tribute to those memorialized senator for a brief second. And an answering present for them, these senators live again in this chamber. Family members, please stand when your senator's name is called. Now, Mr. Clerk, call the roll.
Baker. Bland. Caskey. Kaysen. Graylick. Johnson. Melton. Quick. Russell. Schneider. Sims. Vogel. Yeckel.
Once again, here is a Calvary Lutheran High School men's choir performing the Star Spangled Banner.
Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleaming, whose broad stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight o'er the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streaming, and the rocket's red glare, the bombs bursting in air, gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Oh, say does that star-spangled banner yet wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave?
It is my pleasure to now introduce to you the Minority Floor Leader, Gina Walsh. Senator Walsh has been serving the people of North St. Louis County since 2003 when she was elected to the House of Representatives. Today I'm happy to call her a friend and Senate colleague.
As we prepare to close today's ceremony, I am pleased to add my appreciation and gratitude for the work of the senators who have gone before us and whose memory we honor today. The Senate has a reputation of being more, shall we say, the deliberate chamber. After all, inscribed upon our very wall are the words, "A free and fair discussion will ever be found in the firmament friend of truth." These words have helped guide this chamber for the past 100 years, reminding all who serve in this hallowed chamber that when we speak for the people, all voices must be heard. The senators we remember today spoke for the people of their districts, their communities, and this great state. And together, those many voices made a great chorus that moved our state forward to a brighter and more prosperous future. And they did it with joy, with vigor, and with an enduring love for our state and nation. It reminds me of an old story of 3 bricklayers. As the story goes, a man came upon a construction site where the 3 bricklayers were hard at work. The man asked the first, "What are you doing?" And the worker replied, "I'm carrying these bricks from over here to over there." He asked the second worker, "What are you doing?" And the worker replied, "I'm stacking the bricks and joining them with mortar." As he approached the third, he heard that worker humming a tune as he worked. And he asked, "What are you doing?" The worker stood, looked up at the sky, smiled, and said, "I'm building a cathedral." Those of us who serve today do so with the privilege of having outstanding examples to follow. Senators who saw the daily work of this chamber as the ongoing effort, not of stacking mere bricks, but of contributing their part to the great cathedral that is Missouri. Work that ensured that children, families, and businesses of this state will have every opportunity to reach their God-given potential. We are grateful for their service. We honor their memory, and in doing so, we rededicate ourselves to continuing their good works piece by piece with our eyes ever to the sky. Thank you, and God bless.
Now, would you please stand for our benediction by our Senate Chaplain, Reverend Carl Gott.
God, the generations rise and pass away before you. You are the strength of those who labor. You are the rest of the blessed dead. We rejoice in the company of your saints. We remember all who have lived in faith, all who have peaceably died, and those most dear to us who rest in you. Give us in time our portion with those who have trusted in you and striven to do your holy will. To your name, with the church on earth and the church on heaven, we ascribe all honor and glory, now and forever. Amen.